here.
Okay. Okay. Am I audible? Okay. Uh, yeah. Okay.
Yes, you're audible.
So we think that proposition side, opening government essentially misses the bay because international bodies can regulate not only for all the harms that OG says, but if the pharmaceutical structure is already inadequate for opening government side, it is unclear why any kind of development will exist on their side of the house. Lastly, we would like to point out for opening government's case is that medicine is not a cultural thing. Everyone eats them. Just because you don't have Wi-Fi in certain developing countries doesn't mean you won't take medicine, because we are all physically composed of the same thing. Our stance in opening opposition is simple. We want medical research, but we don't want bio bonds. We think that without government backing, there's going to be more incentive for foreign investors to come invest in our market, and there's going to be less niche developments if the government were to back this, right? Second of all, we believe that we should sell private bonds that the companies are individually in charge of on their own. And three, we believe on both sides of the house, medical NGOs and other multilateral organizations could fund and support these developments on both sides of the house, right? And lastly, we think that we should separate private companies doing their own research and the government doing their own research, right? So onto our first constructive argument on why bio bonds are uniquely bad for the development of the country. This is bad because there's going to be less development because the government now shoulders the burden of the bonds. Number one, first reason, because bio bond having the backing of the government, there is a certain extent in which the government can dictate and direct where the money is being used. But the electoral majority would not want the niche medicines that need to be developed. They do not want diverse and new medicines. What they want is the majority medicines that they're going to use. What they want is something that the majority wants. And therefore, there's going to be because of this association and the bond, because of the bonds and the governments, these bio bonds are now going to be hijacked and co-opted into doing something that to developing less diverse medicines. And because government has less incentive to push medicine, as they'll lose money, because if they develop something and they fail, they can't sell it. The government cannot sell this, and there's no incentive to take risks or basically there's no incentive for government to take any risk to develop niche medicines that they can't work or they cannot make profit from. But second of all, the private incentives are more likely to invest in all of those more niche markets instead of the general markets that the government were more likely to go for, because the majority wants that. Therefore, on government side of the house, there's going to be less private investors coming in, because the medicine that the government is trying to provide is not going to be an untapped market in which the foreign investors want. And private companies would be the only way that companies will want to diversify new medicines, right? Into our second argument on why there's going to be less foreign investors, and there's going to be less investment in general. So number one, there's going to be state control, so there's going to be less environment. We already said this, but given that other countries might not have this type of regulation, or that doesn't have the government backing it, right? I mean that government control is not as preferable as compared to a free company in which foreign investors can earn and get all their money back. And the companies will be developing in more niche and more untapped markets that are more likely for foreign investors to want to invest their money in. And so the comparative that government side has to deal with is a world in which there's going to be a market, private companies versus a world in which these companies are developing things that are for the majority, right? So we believe that, so on opening opposition, we believe that because of this because of the government backing, the government are now forced to adhere to the public's interest, and the public's interest would force the government to make the decision based on majority and not do something for the private. If the government were not to do this, if opening government was to say, oh, but the government will just spend all their, the companies can still develop into these niche markets, we will say no, because in developing countries where the political power is still rather comparatively unstable, we say that investing in niche markets will only cause civil unrest. People will not be happy with the money that is being spent into other things that they cannot actually use. Instead, they would want things to be developed into medicines that actually they can actually use. Therefore, we believe that there is no incentives for government opening government to say that they will develop any sort of niche and diverse medicines. Instead, all the medicines they develop will be general and not really useful. Okay, I'll take a point.
Look, we ensure that companies have money to pay back foreign investors. That means they get more money. We have no influence over the medicines they research, though there isn't state control. And the fact that people eat different diets, walk different distances, live in different elevations impacts the effectiveness of the medications being researched. Please deal with the facts and not your interpretation of them.
Yeah. What we're saying is that your government backing things up is going to affect this to a certain extent. We're not saying that those facts doesn't matter. This will be dealt further into by the second speaker. And so what have the opening opposition told you? We have told you that because of our private incentive, because of our private market, there's going to be more foreign investments. There's going to be more money coming to our country. And there's, on the comparative side, what they have to prove is that why the government control is going to lead for more investors to come, why there's going to be more people coming, despite the investment being on a more general thing that nobody wants to invest in. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for that fine.
Hi, can everyone hear me if I talk like this?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. For POIs, whatever works for you. So either verbalize or type in chat. I'll try to accept one. Cool. Yeah, recording resumed. That's okay. I'm okay with recording. The problem of opening government is I think the Sri Lanka example, which they kind of hinged their case on, can be solved as Maiden correctly identifies with multilateral organizations and media scrutiny that already prevents the worst off of abuses from happening on both sides of the house. But here's the problem of opening government. If their characterization is that there's a vast asymmetry between the developing world and the developed world in the capacity for them to make medicine, then my question is, if they solely invest in the developing world, what medicine do they get? Because listen to both speeches. They say the infrastructure is really bad. There's no capacity for the infrastructure to be developed, and there's a lack of incentive for STEM education to be ever invested in developing world. If that is the case, what bio bonds are you investing into? What medicine do you actually get on our side of the house? Because if they wanted to talk about their example of Sri Lanka, you know what makes it more harmful for the women on the ground that are vulnerable? It is when they have no alternatives and they're forced to turn towards these Western pharmaceutical companies, because that is the only individual that has the capacity to offer the medicine. So on our side, if we're able to prove that you get more access to medicine on net, we're also able to conveniently take out the argumentation as well. 3 things in my speech. Number 1, why opening government loses. Number 2, why private incentives are good. Number 3, why government incentives are uniquely bad, and those get emboldened as a result of biobond. Clarification number 1. I think the reason as to why opening government is out of this debate is simple. Number 1, their characterization knifes their case. Because if their characterization is that the developing world lacks capital and therefore also lacks medicine, I don't understand what they're investing with the biobond. The upshot of that is literally they just get no investment on their side of the house, because insofar as DPM says the state can strategically choose what companies to invest into, if they recognize that all the companies are bad because there's no infrastructure, because of the asymmetry of resources and like the history of colonialism that's subjected the developing world to a lack of infrastructure, then there's just nothing for them to invest into. If they case shift in closing government and say that biobonds can also be extended to Western companies, that's the same moment in which all of Mason's argumentation applies. Because as Mason correctly identifies, no thank you, there's no incentive for the West to ever come in if the government has massive control over your company. Therefore, to that end, I think they lose this debate. First question, on which side of the house do you actually get more investment? If I'm able to prove that there's more investment on our side of the house, I think we also conveniently take out opening government, because that means that the vulnerable women in places like Sri Lanka that are subject to really abusive practices now have more choice, because there's no more medicine for them to pick as to what they're actually going to do. The problem of opening government is that therefore uncomparative, because I don't understand comparatively on their side of the house, how do they get medicine? What did we say on our side of the house? We said two things. Number one, we said that corporations are profit driven. And as a result of that, this is good, because insofar as it is true that developing worlds are oftentimes an untapped market for medicine, there's an incentive to enter into it. But number two, we said there's an incentive to maximize profit in all instances from the side of the private corporations. The reason as to why this is important is because this pretty much takes out all of the argumentation coming from opening government. Three things under that. Number one, there's inter-market competition. That's to say, if I'm a Western company, I'm competing with other Western companies as well. As a result of that, I probably have an incentive to do research. That's why a lot of the arguments about cultural missimilarities are probably wrong. Because like, if I'm coming in and I'm giving you medicine and you don't have pans, like I have an incentive to make sure I realize that before I make the medicine, or else I'm spending more money than I have to. But number two, I also think that's just not true to the point in which like medicine generally across the board are relatively similar. I think companies aren't stupid enough that they're able to take into account like differences in like diets and things of that nature. But number three, also like a lot of their argument about like solar panels and whatnot is out of this debate, because this is about medicine. Like I don't think medicinal companies provide solar panels on either sides of the house. The point here to note is that insofar as it is true that on our side of the house, there is an incentive to understand the consumer base you're tapping into. I think we prevent a lot of the harms that opening government goes about. What then changes on their side of the house that actively detracts from this profit-driven incentive? What we said was that bio bonds were exclusively bad because they muddled the water between private and public spheres in terms of medicinal research. Why then was this bad? Two things. Number one, to the point in which you muddle this water, you now create a perception that the government might take your medical companies. Because what ends up happening typically when governments are significant as a player within a certain sphere is that they have the capacity to do so. That's why in the past, in places like Cuba, there's massive expropriation that happened with certain private corporations, and therefore you got lack of investment in those areas because no private companies have an incentive to go into those areas because like, oh, we're just going to lose a company to the individual government there. But number two, also like companies like control, right? They like to be able to have autonomy and control. So to the point in which the government has bio bonds and therefore are directly going to have a say in what the company can do because they have a majority stake because they're the ones issuing the private bonds, they now have less of an incentive to ever invest. Why then was this harmful for opening government? Three things. Number one, you get less money in FDI. The tangible benefit on the ground is you also therefore get less medicine because these companies don't ever invest. So if they wanted to talk about choice and maximizing and empowering the consumers, when you have more choice, that's the same moment in which you're able to like reject abusive practices from Western companies. That never happens. Also note here, there's like the market incentive. So like if a company is really abusive, I'll just turn to another company. That happens more when you have more investment on our side of the house. Number two, you create symbiotic relationships that is important because the problem in the comparative is if their characterization is true that developing companies are so struggling, I don't understand how they get help. On our side of the house, they get help because when Western companies come in, they bring things, for example, like exposure. They think things, for example, like technology. That is the fastest way in which you're able to develop. That is why a lot of countries like China was able to develop, because they were able to symbiotically benefit from trading with, for example, the UK and getting the resources they had back when like China was like in this dynasty's form, right? So as a result of that, you got more development on our side of the house because you're literally able to reach and symbiotically coexist with the resources of the Western companies. You never get that when Western companies do not have an incentive to come in. But number three, as a result of that, in terms of magnitude and weighing on our side of the house, there's more chance of developing because any single counterfactual they want to go for, we get on our side of the house as well. The delta in this debate is we also got private corporations. They do not get any of that. That's why they lose. Last question. Why then is it that public companies and like bio bonds are exclusively bad because of their association with the government? Even if you don't buy any of this, this independently wins us the round. Number one, we said state control was bad because states are risk averse because if they lose a lot of money, they become electorally unpopular and therefore they don't get elected. As a result of that, there's an incentive to save money as much as possible. So they're never going to take risks. As a result of that, even if they can prove that developing companies exist and the state has an incentive to invest in them, oftentimes you get worse medicine because the state is unwilling to take risks, especially given DPM says the state can choose which ones they want to invest bio bonds into. Like just look at it in status quo. Oftentimes vaccines come from private corporations and not the state because the state recognizes if they spend a lot of money on it, which is taxpayer money, and it doesn't work out, they get a lot of shit and they don't get reelected. So there's an incentive not to do so. So that's why state control is bad. Bio bond emboldens the control of the state. But second of all, even if you do get medicine, our argument was that you end up only getting majoritarian medicine. So the minority who are the most vulnerable never gets help. Because if your medicine only helps 10 people, even if it's a really bad disease, there's no incentive for the state to ever invest money into helping it. The private corporation incentives is what gets that, because these private corporations have the ability to take sunk costs because they don't need to be accountable to an electorate. On their side of the house, you never get these niche medicine, and therefore the individuals on the ground likely suffer. The way off is simple. We got more medicine, we got more investment. We hope the development of these developing countries as well. For all those reasons, very happy to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. To open up the closing half of this debate, let's call on member of the government. Here.
Hello. For pure eyes and for pure eyes, I prefer to have them by voice. It's easier for me to keep up, so I don't have to look at the chat. And I'm fine with recording also. Right, so this debate suffers from an extreme lack of clarity. So the first thing I'm gonna do is to just give really clear framings for what this debate is about. As info slide provided for you, that these bio bonds have limited state backing. So this debate isn't really about either private is entirely good or government is entirely bad. That this debate is about a context where the private takes a majority of the state and the states have some small amount of leverage on private companies to make sure they do play by the rule. This look like, for example, the private companies have somewhere between 85% to 90% of the share, and the state takes about 10% to 15%, depending on what the arrangement can be, right? So this debate exists in a spectrum where there's cooperation between private and state. This is not a debate about either the private is entirely terrible or entirely good, because that simply is irrational to think that there is absolute evil on both sides. So we want to engage with the best case scenario with an open opposition on two fronts. One is the idea that private companies are good and they are going to do everything they can to help people if they can earn the most amount of profit out of it. Two is that the states under their side, the developing country, when left alone, are best able to engage with the people on the ground. We're gonna prove to you why we do both fronts better. That will be our extension. First one, on developing countries' government, why will they be better to do the things they are supposed to do better on our side? Right, we want to give you three characterizations to really clarify what developing country look like. One is that usually suffer from an extreme depletion of resources or human capitals, right? This was briefly illustrated by opening government, but never really explain why it's important. This is important in terms of you need a division of labor, right? You cannot spend all the money into all the things at the same time. At the same time, you try to cure blindness. There are people who are dying on the side of the road because they have malaria. So that means the state must prioritize resources in such a way that you prioritize the mass majority of people to make sure that you maximize the utility of the money that you limitedly have, right? So when opposition side say, oh, it's bad to cater to majoritarian interests, we don't think that's necessarily important to consider, because the states does have to cater into majority's interest, but with our model of a bio bond, it means that the state is able to do the things without having to care about niche market researches. It doesn't have to spend malaria funding and blindness funding at the same time. It can just focus on malaria, where there's the most number of people dying at that point. Second, this developing country, they can actually use a lot of private capital's resources, right? So the reason why private investment still want to come in, and it's kind of affirmed by the open opposition that the private company do want to come in, right? It just said they want to come in when there's a lot of money, when there's 100%, but they suddenly are unwilling to come when they can only hold 85% of the money. We don't understand why necessarily the case, because 85% of the money is still going to be sizable amount of money. We think that it's still going to be enough incentive for those private companies to come in. So what happened when they do come in is they also supplemented the lack of resources from developing countries to make sure that it's easier for them to help people with the outside technical and technological assistance from the outside. Number three, we think there is a huge trade-off the government have to make when they think about what kind of people to help. And usually, yes, according to opposition side, it's unpopular to help the people who are suffering from minor diseases. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those people don't need to be helped. There need to be still some mechanism to help them. And this solution allows developing countries to distance itself from the political consequences of allocating money for people who are blind, as opposed to allocating money to people who are dying from drinking water. Right, so we think that even if those people are minorities, there still need to be a solution. We are the one who provide it to you, because a private funding will be the one who will help those poor people, those minorities, not the the government doesn't have to take most of the responsibility. And that is why when open opposition say, most of the voters will be very unhappy with government taking a stake in a disease that nobody has. That is untrue, because the motion states explicitly it is a limited government exposure to the risk. So that means you're probably gonna get very limited backlash, politically speaking, as well. We don't think that the most of the voters are gonna be so angry about 15% of the funding that being allocated to some small medical bills they don't even really care about, if they can get most of their needs satisfied already. So secondly, let's move on to the second extension about why it's better for private market, right? We think that as much as we want to agree that open opposition say private companies are great and they are awesome, we think that there are instances where the private free market does fail. For example, tragedy of commons, for example, the natural monopoly when it comes to the resources allocation, that there are many things that can still go wrong, and they need to be some sort of fail safe for the state to hold it against the private companies. What the government can do is by holding the leverage to say, unless you let me to have some level of leverage, I won't let you come in. And when I do come in, there are 15% that are hold it by the state. Yes, point.
You can't have your cake and eat it too. If the state has limited control so they won't get backlash, then they cannot check on the private companies. If they gain more control, then it means they become accountable to the public. So you can't make niche medicines. You can't get both of those.
So my point is the state doesn't need to have a lot of leverage, because as you said earlier, private company already want to have most of the benefit allocated to the people. There are three particular reasons. One is they want to have more access to the drugs in the market, because it's more reasonable to have more people buying your drug than very few people paying high price for that drug. The more people they have means that they have more sustainable profit in the long term, as opposed to small amount of money in the short term. Two, they want to have more liberal access to different type of diseases as well, so that they can like separate their risk, so that they are not only allocating their resources to one particular type of disease. So that means that there are going to be more competition of different diseases out there. Government doesn't need to have all the control. It just needs to make sure that when things do go wrong, for example, they price AIDS drug too high, then they can remove patent from them, or temporarily suspend the patent, so that when other drugs are available, they can resume to having patent again, right? So number three reason why the free market is actually working very well, because companies most of the time care about their image, because they're selling more than one medicine, they're selling one product. Microsoft sells computer and sells Xbox at the same time. If you establish a good image of Microsoft, you're more likely to buy other derivative products from the same companies. So by having established images to say you are conscious companies, they're actually getting more benefit out of it. So it's more interest for company to care about the long term rather than abuse the consumers in the short term. For these reasons, it's good to have state and private complement to each other. That's why we will win.
Thank you for that fine speech. Let's now call on member of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Hello, yes, you're audible.
Okay, so I am starting. I would my preferred gender pronouns are he and him, and I will prefer to take POIs in chat. Okay, so I'm starting in three, two, one. We do not buy, and we will not buy the categorization done by the opening half of of this debate, because they are simply debating on a very extreme level. The first opening comment is simply saying that okay, private organizations would not be able to do these kind of the things. So government intervention is kind of important and these kind of the things, which is simply not the debate at their side of the house. They have to argue that why they need limited kind of things and why there should not be a limited why there would be a limited government intervention and why they should not be. And secondly, the opening half is simply saying that okay, private companies are very good and they will do something these kind of things. This is not the approach this motion demands. The opening opposition has to argue that why the private companies should not have limited intervention of the government, but there should be more check and balance of the government. This is the approach which closing government is simply coming up with, and this is something which is new in this debate. The closing opposition will argue you on two tangents. The first tangent is the idea that what are the key macroeconomic issues of the third world countries and why it is actually affecting or getting impact onto the health department. And secondly, we will tell you that how more government intervention and more check and balance of the government will actually give you kind of benefits within the country or in the health or medicinal environment. No, thank you. So the first idea, we say that the problem which the opening government or closing government were trying to identify within their debate are will fall flat because of the fact that the private organization come here to come here for two reasons: a, for the profit maximization; b, for the cheap labor. Even if the government has a lot of lot of intervention into it and a lot of you can say they are doing their own kind of research, but the companies are doing their own kind of research. They have a lot of incentives to come here because their costs come to decrease, or their costs come down because of the fact that they are having the cheap labor. Secondly, they are exploiting the, or you can say not exploiting, or actually benefiting from the cheap raw material. And lastly, we say that they would be benefiting from the kind of infrastructure they are having and would paying the low rents, and this is resulting into the more profitability of there. So the idea coming from the opening government first from the closing opposition that they would not be able to invest is closing government, they would not be able to invest. They would invest because they have these kind of the incentive in and on itself. But why there should be the government regulation within this debate? The government regulation should be there because when these private companies come here after producing their products and after researching into it, there are two kind of the things they would do. A, they would sell the product with their own kind of the choice of the price, because the government has limited intervention and they would not, the companies would not give up onto the profit maximization because they are only working from the profit incentive within your country. So the prices which they would be charging are unaffordable from for the people living in the country, because you have already considered that in third world countries the majority people are living have low living standard and do not have actually resources to buy these kind of the product. So the research which you are doing or the products which are which you are making would simply unaffordable for those people to buy. So the idea which you are bringing or kind of change you are bringing simply falls flat. You would not have any kind of incentive at your side of the house. But on to the second level, we say when you will do these kind of the research, what are kind of vibes XYZ process within this debate. We say that when the government will simply do research on their own or would invite the private organization to do these kind of things, two things gonna happen. The first is the idea that the government sector is already doing certain kind of investment within their self, but not dependent on the private organization. But what is this simply showing that government is will show that they are not shying away from this particular burden. Also, they are not dependent on the other companies to to begin with. But lastly, we say that this is the kind of the thing happening at the lower level will actually come to a greater point with the passage of the time, and that's what we need. But on to the third level, ladies and gentlemen, we say that the idea that these organizations which are coming to the which are coming to the third world countries have kind of incentives would not given to your people. What are the key macroeconomic issues? The first macroeconomic issue in your country is unemployment. What and how you are gonna deal with it? Because of the fact that your people are facing the low living standard because of the high rate of unemployment. But we will do two kind of things. The money you are gonna invest invest there, or the kind of the leverage you are giving to the private organization, they would simply hire the people on very low wages, and this is something which is actually problematic. We say that when you will allow these private organization, but you will do certain kind of agreement with your will, because now you have a harsh kind of check and balance on them. So on that particular agreement, what we are gonna do is two things. The first is the fact that these people will get the unemployment, so the government burden could be reduced, and this is something which is important. And secondly, that thing would be teaching or people within the society that how you can produce certain kind of the products. But lastly, we say that the why process which is coming here is the fact that when these industries are doing research and government has certain kind of the agreement with them, these researchers will educate definitely with research to the university students living in the third world countries, or actually teaching them about these particular things. This is the incentive which is existing at all side of the house when these private organizations work entirely independent with the limited government intervention. They would not give these kind of the benefit to your country, but they would simply work for their profit maximization. But even if we say that the government do not want to do these kind of the things, what are the other things they do? So even if the private companies do not want to come, we say that we have alternatives which we can use to get these medicines from, because the developing countries has kind of issues like inflation and these kind of things, and they are dealing with that because of the fact that they do not have money. So what is happening at their side of the at our side of the house, that we would buy that medicine from the west countries which are really developed, right? And they would give us on a subsidization because of the collateral ties we have made with them. But on to the second idea, we say that even if the ties are not made, what will happen? The medicines of the cancer, the medicines of the corona vaccination, these things are coming to the third world countries just because of the sake that the third world countries are the poor on the subsidization, and these people are getting benefit out of it. So the on to this particular level, the idea of the reaching out of the people with this particular thing is actually coming out onto it. There's a kind of thing that, okay, engage with opening government. We would not engage with opening government because opening government is irrelevant in their case, and they were not actually trying to debate on their side of the house. So on a very simple reason, we claim that the idea came from the both side of the houses, from the opening opposition and from the opening government, from the closing government. They are trying to simply play on card that, okay, either you will get that, or you will not you will not get that. But what we are telling you, that we are simply showing to you that what are the incentives existing at all at a house in viewing the context of the third world countries. And lastly, secondly, we are showing to you the things that how you can get onto these medical research. And for thirdly, we are showing to you that why these research will actually benefit to you, and your government will not be dependent on the on these private organizations, but simply they would not be hegemonized. And we say that the new capitalism ideology will exist here when you will allow these kind of the privatization, because you have dire need of the medicine, when that is the precedent which you are setting for the other kind of the industries like clothes or whatnot, because you have kind of need. When you will have kind of need of it, you will allow these investors to come come without the with the limited government intervention, which will hegemonize your society without the government intervention, and the supply side chain will started, which would affect your country at the majority level, and that will cause a high hyperinflation within your country with the hegemonization of these institutions. And when these will hegemonize, they will definitely intervene into your political processes or whatnot, simply showing that the third world countries would be hegemonized, would be setting up the environment of the colonialism, which has been actually which has caused these kind of the harms, which opening half is actually telling simply of closing opposition.
Thank you for that fine speech. To finally wrap up the case of the government, calling on government whip. Hear, hear.
Can anyone hear me? Hello?
Yes, you're audible.
That's good. So POIs through chat. Here. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So turning throughout the relatively messy debate, what has occurred in this case? So what I've heard is from the closing opposition, you've heard an idea that somewhat differs from the opening opposition. So generally what the opening closing op is talking about is increasing employment by having extensive state intervention. And as the closing government, we'd like to reiterate what this debate is about. What the closing government has brought to the table by the member speaker, and what we have uniquely clarified is this debate is simply about whether or not the government should take any role within the investors in case. As this debate has boiled down to an extent where both sides concede that it is useful to have investors to come into the country at these times of crisis. Right now, it's about whether or not, or to what extent, the state needs to intervene or needs to intervene itself to enable to ensure that there is no exploitation or no large magnitude of harm incurred by the people in this case. So generally, as a very quick rebuttal to the entire closing opposition case about extensive government intervention for employment in this case, it's just the idea that no, we do not necessarily need to sort of suck up all the labor by making them work on these projects. There are other projects that can simply be worked on. Now simply now that point out of the way, simply talking about what the closing government has brought to this debate in this case. So what the closing government has uniquely told you in this case. So as the closing government, we already told you that the investors will definitely want to enter the country anyway because of the opportunity in this case, and they do not need 100% of the profit to want to come in. This 85% is simply enough in this case. It will tell you that the companies as well will definitely want to look nice to a certain extent. They'll definitely want to look quite humanitarian or look quite ethical in this case. So what does this look like? If a developing country says, hey, we can let you invest in here and we will assist you in this case, we can help you to a certain extent in this case. You can come in, but we want at least 15% of the profit, and we want at least some control over what the project is, what is happening in the project, and what the business will likely say, sure, why not, and goes in there and carries out the project. We tell you that they're not going to, unlike the closing opposition's characterizing, they won't immediately inflate the price whenever they get the chance to, because we tell you that they'll definitely want to look nice. However, we tell you that there is still a substantial amount of risk in doing so, because although we said that they definitely want to look nice, we do not want to leave it completely up to fate as to whether or not they want to price fairly. That's why we curate this mechanism, this moderate tone mechanism, in order to ensure that these companies remain ethical in their dealings in this case. So before I move on, I'll take a POI from the opening opposition, that is.
Jeff concedes that private corporations can self-regulate on both sides. What then is the unique benefit on your side if our setup from OO was that states and private medicinal sectors can develop simultaneously with a clear delineation, which means we get all of your impacts, whereas your burden, per what OG said, is to muddle the line and make it harder for governments to invest into niche markets?
Currently, what the opening opposition is trying to say is the state can develop itself, or the state can do this, and just constantly says the state can just spew moolah all over the place. But then the idea here is these are developing countries. The ACTA motion specifically states a developing country. So what we're trying to say here is we're trying the moderate tone in which the developing country can allow a private firm in a country to assist it, but will still keep a fail-safe mechanism in which these corporates to make sure these corporates do not exploit the populace in this case. Although we already told you that corporates are unlikely to do so, we do not want to blindfold ourselves and walk on a tightrope without any reassurance in this case. What we're trying to say is, yes, what we're trying to say is, with the analogy, yes, we think the ship is definitely well built, but we do not want to go on without a lifeboat or a life jacket. Now what the opening opposition's whole premise is right now rests on, and this has been engaged already, it's the idea that the developing countries have unlimited cash that I can just throw all over the place and develop sideways in this case. So what the closing government has already uniquely contributed over and over again is that these developing countries have finite resources, so therefore we have this mechanism in place so that the development can still happen, but the state can still have some control over it and to keep it accountable and reliable in this case. So what necessarily is the benefit? Now, what Jeff has already told you is the benefit from the closing government here is that what can happen is the developing country can refocus some of its financial resources onto other projects, in this case, more tangible, quick projects that can assist the populace on a large magnitude. Now note what this does. This gets rid of the harm that has been identified by the opening government and that has been sort of mentioned by the opening opposition and even the closing opposition as well. The harm here is the idea of these medicines being too niche and not helping the general populace. What we're saying is if we allow these firms to take care of it, which is what closing opposition discusses this as well, is and it concedes to it as well, is if we allow the firm to take care of this, the government can reinvest its material elsewhere in this case. And what does this do? This satisfies the closing opposition's questions about employment in this case. You can employ people, you can build better infrastructure, and you can help the general populace as a whole. And after about 5 to 10 years, when the final medicine does come out and the patent sort of wears off, then the general populace also has the medication. Then therefore the benefits come on both sides. Then the benefits come on our side of the house as well. Now, even if the patent does last for a few years, and that's sort of the idea of the whole incentive thing, we said that another company, once the medicine is out, will definitely, an internal company will probably be able to take it further. 0 to 1 is more difficult, 1 to 2 is not as difficult as in that case. So, you know, 0 is still better than 1, obviously. So as long as the medicine is out, the benefit is there. So there's no use completely making sure that these investors aren't in the country, or intervening to the extent where the whole state wastes all its resources on just pure control or just pure free market. As I told you, both sides are way too extreme. What the closed government here, after all of our whole characterization and all of our whole arguments and points point to, is the closing government is driving a moderate line in which the populace is not exploited, cures are discovered, and the government is more accountable to its people by developing better infrastructure and greater societies that can be felt by the entire society as a whole, and any of the benefits will come to the populace either sooner or later. And we tell you that this is likely to come within 5 years, which is better than thousands and thousands of people dying from malaria or cholera or unclean water within the societies every now and then. For that reason, we are proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. To finally wrap up the case of opposition, let's call on opposition whip. Hear.
I'll take the PIs in the chat box. Just confirm me if I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, so I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it's very disappointing to see that in a semi-final, the motion is still not understood by three benches in this house. They fail to understand a very simple comparison on which, or the very simple comparative that this debate was based on. The comparative was very simple, that there is a specific thing attached to biobonds, because you see the opening half, they were confusing privatization with biobonds. The simple thing that is additional in biobonds is that there is a limited control or limited guarantee of state involved into it. We told you on our side of the house that you should not go for biobonds because they have very limited states control and they have very negative incentives towards these developing countries. So you basically should not opt out for them because they are only going to hurt you in multiple levels, and we proved to you how that hurting is going to translate into your local people. But these things were never understood or even engaged by the closing opposition, closing government. Why does closing government falls out of this debate? Because closing government fails to understand and fails to engage with the whole argumentation of closing opposition by just saying that, look, employment will exist. They fail to understand that what were our analysis about whole macroeconomical problems and how we link them with the projects such as biofunds, and we told to you that how they are going to negatively impact you on multiple spheres, but they simply failed to understand that idea, and they did not engage with us. And secondly, they concede to the fact that yes, state control should exist, but they fail to understand that, and they fail to elaborate that to us in their speeches, that why that state control should be a limited control. Because you see, opening government as well as closing government concedes to a certain extent that yes, states control should exist, but they fail to prove us that why that state control should be in a limited amount, because that was the comparative of this debate that both government benches have failed to understand. And last thing, the POI that even we asked, that what is the incentive structures for these biofunds to invest in these countries, in these third world countries or in these developing countries, was a big question on their whole case that they failed to answer. We asked them, if some pharmaceutical company or some research company is going to invest inside your country, what are their incentives to invest in there? They had two incentives that were highlighted by only closing opposition, and no side has still able to be able to grasp that concept. We told you that they come into your country and they deploy their resources here because they want your local cheap labor into it, and then they want to produce some things that they want to sell at a very higher rate to your local people, because that is one of the things that they might be producing in their own countries as well, with better infrastructure facilities available as well. So if they are going to send those things to the other country, the idea brought by opening government, they are not going to send those from your local indigenous areas. They are going to send that from their own countries. For example, US is coming to research in Sri Lanka and producing some niche medicines. They are producing that in their own country as well, right? Because that is the only possible reason or possible explanation why they are coming here and producing here as well. So they are going to export into the world the things that are being produced in US, and the things that are being produced inside Sri Lanka somehow, even in their best case scenario, if they are able to produce something, because the infrastructure and political dynamics of the states does not allow that. But even if they produce it, they are just going to sell to elite of their own country, and it is being, because it is being manufactured in a very less amount, and it will be quite expensive for the local majority to attain to it. So we believe that there is no marginal benefit whatsoever on the side of government bench, but there are potential harms that we so mechanistically analyzed in this debate that are going to exist only and only in the world of government. Why does OG falls out of this debate and they have no chance in this debate? Firstly, their whole case was based on two examples, and we told to you that how those examples did not contain any mechanistic analysis and did not even link their concept with how it was linked to biological bio bonds, right? And secondly, we told to you that on a comparative, all those benefits that you're trying to say were achieved through those examples are still possible on our side of the house through organizations like World Health Organization existing in the world. They can still spread the awareness in local people, and they can still tell them to take medicines, right? And they can put that external pressure on states that you have been blatantly ignoring in this debate, right? So if that is possible, and all those positive benefits that you're trying to say were caused through these bio bonds, according to you, are still possible through exerting external pressures like international organizations, we don't need an a foreign invasion in our country that is going to take employment job opportunities from us and is going to sell those medicines which when we can get on subsidized rate from those international organizations, from those international human rights corporations. That was explained by my first speaker. We don't need to take such a burden through bio bonds, and that is why we don't think so the developing country need biological bonds at the very first place. And secondly, the opening government falls out of this debate when they fail to understand the political dynamics and the political conditions as well as the socio-economic conditions of third world countries. They do not have that resources or that industry to translate even that research that they will be doing. So even if they are successful in doing some research, they are just going to use those scientists for their own benefits. Either they will take them to their own country, or even if they try to produce something within their own country, they are going to sell at a higher rate, hence benefiting only those private bio bonds selling or funding bodies, not to the local people. And we believe that the local people were the more important and far more stakeholders in this debate. And the last comparative that we told to you, and that look, there are some other problems that have to be dealt with, and these problems are not big enough, and there are other possible solutions. And this was a complete analysis that is being missed from closing government, and that is another reason they fall out of this debate, is that we told you in closing opposition that all those niche medicines or all those niche problems have alternative solutions possible and available. They never told to us that how they are not applicable, not in the opening government, not in the closing government. We told you how they are applicable at some extent, so you don't need to burdenize yourself through bio bonds because you don't have that economic capacity to deal with such a burden and not the political capacity to fight against those mafias. Lastly, why does closing opposition take this debate and take this debate clearly? We are the only we are the only team in this house that clearly understand what the concept of bio bonds is, and we tell to you what the spirit of this motion is, that how it is linked to how states should be more involved or not. And we tell you that states should be more involved, because if you allow these bio bonds to function and they come into your country, they are only going to harm you, and there is no benefit whatsoever attached to them. But on a comparative, all those problems that you highlight can be still solved in our side of the house, and for all those reasons is closing opposition.
Thank you for that fine speech, Opposition Whip. Thank you for that very interesting debate. You may now virtually cross the house. Kindly proceed to the main room